Hello, everyone, and welcome to the last episode of this season. The last time we saw Grace, she was in hospital, and we were trying to think about how we can prevent her having another fall. If she does, however, have another fall, what can we do to prevent her having another fracture?
Hello, everyone. The challenge that we face is not to think about secondary prevention as something you do after people go home. We have an opportunity while Grace is in hospital to really do something that can make a difference to her risk of future fractures. But we need to think about that right from the beginning of her time in hospital.
And to stop Grace getting another fracture, we want to get her strong bones. I know when I was a child, there were a lot of adverts for milk to get your calcium in, and I'm sure there's a lot of advertising for vitamin D as well to get strong bones. Do you think we should be giving vitamin D supplementation and calcium supplementation to all of our potential fracture patients, Prof. Johansson?
So when I was at school, I was given free school milk. That was before Margaret Thatcher took it away.
Not that long ago.
That's quite a long time ago now. So we had milk at that stage, and in the generation before me, people were being given cod liver oil as a source of vitamin D. So that's ingrained as something that people believe is important to the integrity of bone. But whether it works as a treatment, I'm less convinced. I'm less convinced. I ran an RCT of giving a form of vitamin D to everybody in care homes in South Wales many years ago, and there have been more meta-analyses of calcium and vitamin D supplementation trials than there have been trials now. But the conclusions from those are rather discouraging. The most relevant study is the record trial that was run in 2005, published in The Lancet, and that randomized people presenting with fragility fracture to receive nothing, or calcium supplements, or vitamin D supplements, or calcium and vitamin D supplements. But none of those treatment arms made any difference. So I think it's a really good demonstration that in the sort of people who we're worried about, who are at risk of fracture, calcium vitamin D on its own is not helpful. It's not enough. And there are clinicians who continue to prescribe calcium and vitamin D because they know that somebody's at risk of osteoporosis, or they know that they're putting them on steroids or doing something that might cause osteoporosis, and they like to think that putting them on calcium and vitamin D is adequate, and it just isn't. We need to think more intelligently.
And what could we do instead of putting a patient on calcium or vitamin D supplementation?
So what did they teach you about at medical schools?
Okay, again, not that long ago. Is it a bisphosphonate that we put them on?
Yeah, so much of the teaching centered on bisphosphonates, and over my career, so when I first started with patients with hip fracture, I was giving everybody calcium and vitamin D until it became apparent that was inadequate. And then we moved on to giving people oral bisphosphonates. So bisphosphonates are drugs that work to bind calcium into the bones and to make bones stronger and prevent them getting weaker as we get older. Most recently we've been using alendronate as a tablet that you take once a week. You take your tablet on an empty stomach first thing in the morning. You have to stand up after taking the tablet, washing it down with a glass of water. It needs to be taken on an empty stomach, because if you take it with food, it's not absorbed. That's quite a cocktail for people to try and remember. In the trials of alendronate, it's very effective at reducing people's risk of fractures of the spine or at other sites. But in reality, we had several years, and Adrian Turk, who was the ward pharmacist who worked with me over the course of quarter of a century on the Cardiff trauma wards, used to spend huge amounts of time explaining the use of alendronate to patients, providing information sheets, following them up to make sure that they were still able to take them. And he was able to show that only about a quarter of patients who we started on alendronate were able to continue with it. They either couldn't understand it or couldn't tolerate it, they got indigestion with it, or it got missed by them or their GP or when they're next admitted to hospital. And a drug that nobody's taking isn't going to be effective. So alendronate is an attractive idea, and occasionally we still use it, or patients would prefer it. but it's really not a drug that's being used pretty much at all in patients with hip fracture now in the UK.
That's really interesting, Prof. Hans. And I didn't know there were so many, I guess, side effects or different profiles that meant alendronate wasn't taken regularly. Or at least I didn't learn that at med school.
No.
What is it that we can give instead?
Yeah, so nice, very keen. It's a very cheap medication, and if everybody was on alendronate, we'd see fewer fractures. The difficulty is that it's not a very practical or a very palatable drug to take, and people don't take it. So what you really want to do is to get it in some other form. And essentially, the next step would be to think about zoledronate, which is an injectable bisphosphonate. So it's the same sort of drug, but you give it in the form of a drip. And we know from trials, and crucially from trials of people like Grace with a hip fracture. She's exactly the sort of person who went into the trial published in the New England Journal of Medicine in 2007, where people were given zoledronate, and this reduced their rate of future fractures by a third. There were suggestions that mortality was reduced in people who went on to zoledronate as well. But crucially, this was a drug that was used in this group of patients. You don't need to worry about whether they took it appropriately or continued to take it, because you gave an infusion of zoledronate in the form of a drip, a bit like an intravenous antibiotic, during the time in hospital. And you know it's gone into them. And you know that it sticks around. A single dose of zoledronate will have an effect on the bone chemistry that lasts for a number of years. And in people like Grace, unfortunately, a third of people who have a hip fracture used to die in the year or so following the fracture, and 2/3 of people would die in the 5 years following a hip fracture. That's the sort of nature of this very old and frail population, and for many of them, a single dose of zoledronate given during their time in hospital will have a biochemically protective effect on their bones, binding calcium into the bones, maintaining bone strength for what will amount to the rest of their life. So it's a really effective and attractive idea. In the trial, it was given repeatedly on an annual basis. But in our practice, we find many of our patients it's not necessary or not practical to be giving repeated doses. And single doses of zoledronate have therefore taken off. And in the time over the last couple of years, we've seen an escalation to the point that half of people presenting with a hip fracture in the UK will receive an infusion of zoledronate before they go home from hospital. And many of the others are now being referred on for consideration of other forms of treatment or for scanning and other tests to look at alternatives.
So given that, well, it seems zoledronate almost has a very protective effect that's almost lifelong. It was really interesting to hear you speak about it. So the way that we approach it for people coming into hospital, to go back to the calcium and vitamin D question, is that when Grace presents to me and we see her in casualty, the first thing that we do is we worry about whether she might have vitamin D deficiency. And it's important that she has got enough vitamin D. Zoledronate's not safe if you give it to somebody who's short of vitamin D. Now, we could measure a blood test and wait a couple of days for the result to come back and then start her on vitamin D supplements. But vitamin D supplements are very cheap. They're a little tablet that has no real side effects. So what we do in our unit is that we start people on a daily supplement of 25,000 units of vitamin D, and they take that over the course of much of the first week in hospital. And we then plan to give them a zoledronate infusion during their second week in hospital. And we also need to remember to give them calcium and vitamin D, or vitamin D in the longer term. Most of our patients go home just taking the daily vitamin D supplement in the long term. People who haven't got any calcium in their diet, who have not got any dairy products in the diet, we would send home simply taking a calcium and vitamin D supplement in the long term. And that's the package that we're delivering on the ward, and that's what you'll be doing for the patients who you're seeing. I don't really need to get involved with that. It's a really simple regime that is very easy for a house officer to do without reference to me,
As we've said, for the majority of frail older people coming through the system with a hip fracture, it's all the treatment you need to think about. So I think junior doctors, everybody, the team needs to recognise the important place of intravenous zoledronate infusions as a simple but effective and very, very cheap. This costs less than a cup of Starbucks coffee. Treatment that will last potentially for many of them for the rest of their lives. So this is something we should have as a population strategy, not just as the right treatment for Grace.
So given that zoledronate is so cheap and it's got such a good long-term effect, why don't I get zoledronate? I won't get any fractures in the future. Why don't we give it to all our patients, say GPs seeing patients in the community who they might think are at risk of fractures? Why don't they get a zoledronate clinic?
So giving intravenous injections to people, the drug may be quite cheap, but if the person is not somewhere where it's easy to give an intravenous injection, you're talking about a lot of additional cost and stress. There is a small proportion of patients who have a slight flu-like illness on the day after an infusion. So it's not without risk and upset. You don't want to give it to people who've got ongoing complex dentistry. So there are caveats on giving it to people who've got problems with dental decay and jaw problems. But for most people, it's an extremely safe thing to do. But you don't want to be giving the whole population a drug until you've demonstrated it's useful for their groups. But for hip fracture, we've demonstrated this is a great idea. How relevant this should be for other groups of patients, perhaps people who are at high risk of falls because of neurological disease, for instance. People who are starting on steroid therapy or hormonal therapy for breast cancer or prostate cancer, I think we will see a growth in how much of it is being used to preempt the possibility of osteoporosis in those patients. So it's there for targeted use at this stage. And I think that's probably the appropriate use for it.
It's definitely interesting, but it seems that, well, why don't we just do the same thing for everyone then?
So we half of the patients who are coming through in the UK are on it. So it's substantially more than that in our hospital. Some hospitals are yet to really get their systems up and running to give zoledronate to lots of patients. There are people for whom it's not suitable. So I've mentioned people who are having ongoing dental work, who you might want to delay until the dentistry has been dealt with. You don't want to give it to people who've got poor renal function. So if people have poor kidney function to the extent of a creatinine clearance of less than 30, and you've calculated that through, it's not safe and we wouldn't use it for those. And that's probably the biggest group of patients in whom it's not suitable. The other group of patients in Grace's cohort, somebody in Grace's position, is that there are some people who present with a broken hip who haven't got osteoporosis. And actually, when you take a history, the nature of their fall, it wasn't a fragility fracture. It wasn't just a fall from a standing height. They fell off their bicycle, their hip hit the ground. They fell downstairs or whatever. So we're talking about people with fragility fractures, a fall from a standing height or less. And finally, there's a group of people in whom you might worry that zoledronate, though it can reduce your risk of future fractures by a quarter or a third, that may be not as much as you'd want to. And in particular, there are groups of patients in whom osteoporosis, and particularly spinal osteoporosis, might justify much more aggressive treatment. So our approach to some of the younger patients who we see in whom a fracture is surprising and might reflect underlying other medical problems, our approach to younger people might involve doing some blood tests, doing a bone density scan to assess whether they do or don't have osteoporosis, and then thinking about some of the more potent osteoporosis drugs. And there are increasingly powerful drugs are being made available for osteoporosis that are more complex to give and more expensive to give, but will be relevant for targeted groups of people, but perhaps not somebody like Grace, whose issues, medical and cognitive problems, make a practical inpatient injection of zoledronate the logical way to sort her out. before she gets home.
And that brings us very nicely onto the end of our podcast today. We've been with Grace on her journey throughout the hospital, from the perioperative acute phase through the rehabilitation process and to sending her home safely today. And it also brings to an end the first season of our podcast.
Yes, thank you. I hope that what we've done is given you a sense of some of the key aspects of the care of older people in general. None of this is restricted to the care of people with hip fractures. These are the major topics that dominate the way in which modern health services need to tackle the challenges, particularly of frailty, delirium, nutrition, falls, those huge topics that are a challenge in an ageing population.
And I just want to say thank you again for listening. I hope it's been engaging for you and you've enjoyed it. Please do make sure to share, follow the podcast, and comment on or email us on any things that you might want to see for a potential season 2. And we'll see you then, hopefully. Goodbye and thank you.
Thank you.